But before we do, let's get a little perspective of Solomon. His name by Nathan the prophet was Jedediah, and beloved of the Lord is what it means, and that's 2 Samuel 12. His royal name, his kingly name is Shelomoth, as we say, Solomon. He had a private name, an intimate name with his mother, Bathsheba, called Lemuel. And it's interesting, in Proverbs 31, it's written by her. She saw in young Solomon some of the characteristics that made her nervous, characteristics of David, chasing after women and what have you. So she counseled him. And it's unfortunate that he didn't really follow her counsel in Proverbs 31. But Solomon also wrote under pen names. He called himself the Koheleth, the preacher. That was his label he adopted for Ecclesiastes. What many people miss is in Proverbs 30, he called himself the Aguar, the collector of riddles. And he gives a messianic riddle that most people miss because they don't translate the Hebrew properly. But anyway, Solomon was David's second son by Bathsheba, or the first surviving son of Bathsheba. It was the first after their legal marriage in 2 Samuel 12. Solomon was probably born about 1035 BC, to give you a frame of reference here. He succeeded his father on the throne. Probably he was 16 to 18 years old by some scholastic reckoning. And he was put on the throne before his father's death because of a plot that was afoot. Nathan and Bathsheba were concerned because of the rebellion that was begun by Adonijah. And so they encouraged and precipitated David to nail that down quickly. Adonijah was the fourth son of David. And after the death of his older brothers, Amnon and Absalom, he became the heir apparent to the throne, it would seem. But Solomon, a younger brother, was preferred to him. So when his father was dying, he caused himself to be proclaimed as king prematurely. Big mistake. Nathan and Bathsheba induced David to give orders that Solomon should at once be proclaimed and admitted to the throne, which they do. David takes his own mule and establishes public testimony that Solomon's the one. Adonijah realizes he's blown it. He fled and took refuge at the altar and received a pardon for his conduct from Solomon on the condition that he showed himself a worthy man. He should have quit while he was ahead. He made a second attempt to gain the throne, but was seized and put to death. And he probably would have been pardoned even then, except Solomon had eyes on Abishag, that was his father's concubine, that had caught Solomon's eye. And the relationship between Solomon and Abishag is at least what some people believe is emblazoned in Song of Songs. But that's again another story. Solomon spared the rest of the brothers who had joined Adonijah, so he probably would have spared Adonijah too, except for the Abishag factor. Abiathar was banished to Anathoth for treason, thus fulfilling an old curse for Eli. Joab the murderer was put to death. That's what David whispered in Solomon's ears when he gave him the kingship. You got to deal with Joab. Joab was his Secretary of Defense, so to speak, is his Secretary of War or whatever. But he was David told him to take care of it. Shimei fell by breaking his own engagement to oath. Solomon's reverent dutifulness to his mother, amid all his other problems, appears in the narrative. You can go through carefully, all the way through, that Solomon looked out for his mother. Now, before his death, of course, David gave parting instructions. And as soon as he had settled himself and arranged his affairs, he entered into an alliance with Egypt by marrying the daughter of Pharaoh. And he favors her, has her in a part of it. When he builds his palace, he builds a fourth of it is for her. And that's the last you ever hear of her, interestingly enough. He has 700 wives, 300 concubines, but it's not clear that any of them were Israeli. So his first half, he starts out pretty well. But the last half of his reign is clouded by idolatries. He got involved with all these women for political reasons, but these women were pagan. And what initially was just his tolerance to allow them to do their thing gradually becomes, it causes him to gradually get entangled with them and causes him to become, in effect, apostate. 700 wives, can you imagine? 300 concubines. Solomon took 7 years to build the temple. That's well understood. What many people miss is that he took 4 years before he began. After being enthroned and that incredible speech by his father David, you'd think that he would have jumped right in and got it done. It took 4 years before he picks up on it. After spending 7 years to build the temple, and we're going to talk a lot about that in the coming chapters, he spent 13 years building his royal palace. And let me tell you, that is wild. It was 100 cubits long. Cubits about 1.5 feet, we assume. It's half as long as a football field. 50 broad, 30 high. The lofty roof was supported by 45 cedar pillars. So the hall was like a forest of cedar wood. So it's sometimes called the House of the Forest of Lebanon. That was a title that scholars use. In front of this house was the porch of the pillars. In front of that again was the hall of judgment, or his throne room. And there's a fourth part of the whole thing that was set apart as the residence of the daughter of Pharaoh, the queen consort. And we don't read anything else about her. So far I haven't found, I've been canvassing all kinds of sources, haven't found anything meaningful on her. He wrote 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. There's a famous incident where the Queen of Sheba, that's an Arabian queen from the south, had heard about him and couldn't believe it. And this secluded Arabian queen, despite the risks and the danger of travel in those days, put forth the energy to visit because she couldn't believe what she'd heard. And when she finally sees it, she's totally undone. Says the half of it wasn't told me. And there is some scholars believe there was a marriage before she returns to Arabia. Another side of Solomon you generally don't get into, but I'll mention just in passing. We'll talk about some of this when we wrap up Solomon later. But everything about Solomon is in sixes. 6 steps to his throne, 6 of this and 6 of that. You'll find sixes all through, which if you look at it in a mystical sense, and the sword level, there's 4 levels of interpretation in the Hebrew. The fourth one, much can be made of this. His annual salary was 666 talents of gold, which is a huge salary, but it's mentioned twice that it's 666, which is, to some, that's sometimes called in the Hebrew a remez, a hint of something deeper. Or some of the rabbis says it's a sign that says dig here. So there's more to it than that. It's interesting that the seal of Solomon is a well-known occultic symbol. It gets adopted in the 14th century AD, and they called it the shield of David. And the official symbol of the government of Israel is the shield, the Magen David, the shield of David. But it has an earlier occultic history as the seal of Solomon. It's used by in occultic terms. So that may or may not be relevant to studies, but it's interesting that Solomon, all through the Scripture, the New Testament, is always used adversely. The lilies of the field, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like these. In other words, it's always used as a standard that ain't quite there. And so if you're a mystic and you're looking at this, there may be far more lying beneath the surface than is typically gotten into.